Hey friends, so last week or a few weeks ago, I had posted about this square neck top that I created using a mashup of the Saltwhistle neckline and facing, as well as the Arlington sweater. So I had so many people ask for a tutorial on how to mash the Saltwhistle neckline with the Arlington top that I'm just gonna walk you through my make with a new piece of fabric. I cannot get enough of these square neck tops, and I just, for some reason, am not finding them in stores. So I'm gonna make my own. And so I had this one that I made for Christmas time, and you can see that I used a facing here. So I'll walk you through how I make the facing, how I adapt the Arlington's neckline into the square Saltwhistle neckline, and how you could probably do the same with another pattern or on your own Saltwhistle Arlington mash. So let's get started. All right, so before we can get too far, let's talk about fabric. Really, that's where a lot of the decisions on how to finish this off will be made if we really consider what the fabric calls for. So I will be using this stretch sweater knit from Style Maker Fabrics. It kind of has like a fake Burberry vibe going on, and I think this will make a really pretty square necked Arlington sweater, and I plan to wear it. My husband and I are going on a little getaway, and we're going to this spa, and it has like kind of fancy dinners at night, and so I plan to wear this really classy top with just some black pants, and I think it'll feel really sophisticated and elegant. So that's what I'm going for with this top. So this fabric, like I said, is a sweater knit. It's pretty stretchy. It doesn't have like a ton of recovery, but it has some. And I think I'm gonna finish the neckline off the exact way that I did for my original make. So I will be cutting a square neckline on the front piece. I will also cut and install a facing out of that same fabric. And then I'm going to do a blind stitch around the neckline. So that's exactly what I did for my last make, and I think it'll work for most fabrics. If you were gonna have a more of a structured jersey knit that you were gonna be making this type of mashup with, you might be able to just do, instead of having like a blind stitch going around the facing, you might just be able to use like some stitch witchery or something to kind of keep, like hem tape to keep everything secure. But I don't really know how that hem tape will work or the stitch witchery will work with this type of fabric, but I think a blind, like a blind stitch will work pretty well to keep that facing down. I do know that I want to keep that facing down and tucked in and finished off really nicely around the neckline. So that is my goal here with this make. As a side note, make sure that you check the pattern placement on your fabric, especially if it's designed. Now is a great time to do that. For step one, let's assemble our supplies. We're gonna need some Swedish tracing paper or some other sort of pattern tracing paper, the Arlington bodice and sleeves pattern pieces, as well as the Saltwhistle facing for front and back. That's where we're gonna get our square neckline. Next, lay out a large sheet of your tracing paper, and you're gonna trace the square L-shaped neckline of the Saltwhistle onto that tracing paper, just the neckline from the center front all the way up to the shoulders. For step three, overlap the Arlington front bodice piece. You're gonna match up the center front lines and butt up the top shoulder lines. Then you're gonna trace the remainder of the pattern from center front, arm, shoulder, side seam, arm side, all the way so that you get the rest of the pattern shape. At this point, you'll notice that the shoulder seams do not match between the Saltwhistle and the Arlington. I'm just gonna take away that top little sliver of a triangle there. And now the shoulder seam will be a mashup of the Saltwhistle at the top all the way to the Arlington's original arm side at the top shoulder point. Next, it's time to redraw or add to the Saltwhistle neckline front facing with that new shoulder seam that we've drawn. To be completely honest, I did not do this with my original make. It's just such a tiny little sliver of a piece. I didn't really think it made that much of a difference, but let's be a little bit more particular here with this make. And all I'm gonna do is just add a little bit of Swedish tracing paper to my facing pattern piece and then redraw that seam so that it is completely aligned. Here is what my full pattern piece is looking like right now. This is my Saltwhistle Arlington bodice, front bodice mash. Now it's time to cut out this pattern piece. And by the way, for reference, I did a large at the bust, blended down to an extra large at the hips. Additionally, I'm pretty short-waisted, so I did not add any length to this pattern piece, but if you prefer, make sure that you add in length before you do the other adjustment. Now it's time to address the back pattern piece. There really is not much of a difference between the Saltwhistle back neckline and the Arlington back neckline. So for this adjustment, all I'm going to do is add a little bit of Swedish tracing paper to the Arlington back pattern piece and then match up the center or the back centers of the facing as well as that pattern piece. And then I'm just going to redraw that line so that the Arlington is just getting a little bit extra added on to its back neckline. Now that the pattern pieces are all complete, we're ready to cut out, and I'm very careful to have everything centered for my pattern fabric. Now, before we start to sew, let's take a look at what the finished product is going to look like. You'll notice that right here we have a blind stitch that is going to be securing the interior facing around the neckline. So we're going to be following the same steps as what the Saltwhistle pattern recommends. We're going to interface both the front and back facings, and then we're going to sew the shoulder seams of the front and the back as well as the facing front and back. Then we're going to finish the outer edge of the facing and then sew the facing to the neckline right sides together. And then you're going to trim that seam allowance and clip the corner. Now that we've got the facing installed, we've got to secure it so it doesn't pop out. That's one of my biggest pet peeves when sewing facings. So I'm going to be using a blind stitch. I want to make sure to use a subtle thread choice. I'm going to be using this brown color to blend in, and I'm going to be using a 3.5 width and a 2.5 length blind stitch. The reason why I'm using this blind stitch is so that you really can't see a strong line of top stitching all through the front of my fabric. So let me show you how I do the blind stitch for the neckline facing. First, you're going to carefully position the fabric layers of that neckline and pin them in place so that it's all flat and even with the neckline laying just right over its corresponding spots on the facing. Then you're going to position the neckline under your machine with the facing on the bottom and its seam allowance on the right-hand side under your presser foot. And then the main fabric is going to be folded over just at the edge of the facing's seam allowance. Then we're just going to let the blind stitch eat into the facing for most of the stitches and then just barely take a little bite into the actual front bodice fabric. So this is what it looks like. Again, you're going to place the facing piece down onto your sewing machine with the seam allowance to the right-hand side. You're going to fold over the main fabric to the left so that the seam allowance from your facing is really what's showing there. And then you're going to position it so that the needle is going into the facing piece most of the time and then just barely grabbing the left-hand side where the main fabric is. Then you're just going to finish the pattern according to the Arlington's instructions. I added the hemband on mine and I used the regular long sleeve. So you can see I have a square neckline using the Saltwhistle neckline matched with the Arlington bodice and sleeves. I love how classic this make is. I love the fabric, and make sure that you're subscribed to our newsletter because we have an extra special little treat in there for this fabric company.